Motown's Studio A had a large window in the control room. It was designed so musicians could see the recording booth, so engineers could watch the artists. But in the summer of 1967, that glass started serving a different purpose: surveillance. Marvin Gaye and Tammi Terrell were recording vocals for Ain't No Mountain High Enough. They stood side by side at the microphone. Marvin whispered something. Tammi laughed, a natural, professional, friendly moment. Then Tammy's laughter froze. Her eyes locked onto a point above the glass. Marvin followed her gaze. Behind the glass, arms folded, completely still, stood David Ruffin. The engineer looked up from his headphones, noticed the discomfort, but said nothing. You don't ask questions at Motown, especially when David Ruffin is involved. He was the lead singer of the Temptations, Berry Gordy's favorite, and Tammi Terrell's boyfriend. So technically, he had a right to be there. But Marvin knew why David was really there: to watch, to control. The recording continued, but everything was different now. Tammy's voice had tightened, her shoulders tensed. Marvin tried to establish the emotional connection the song required, but Tammi wasn't looking at him anymore. Her eyes stayed on the glass, on David, on the silent threat. Let's take it again, the engineer said. Tammi nodded, turned back to the microphone. Marvin looked at her, wanted to ask, "Are you okay?" But couldn't, because David could hear, and David heard everything. In the beginning, the studio had been a safe place for Tammi. When Marvin and Tammi first started recording together in early 1967, Tammi was relaxed and free. She laughed, joked around, exchanged musical ideas with Marvin. They were experimenting with vocal arrangements for the duets written by Nick Ashford and Valerie Simpson. Marvin was discovering how Tammy's voice harmonized with his baritone, and Tammi, perhaps for the first time in her life, felt safe working alongside a man. Because Marvin wasn't like David Ruffin. Marvin was wrestling with his own depression, his own insecurities. He didn't need to possess Tammi. He didn't see her as property. He just focused on the music, and Tammi could breathe in that space. But then David noticed. He noticed that when Tammi went to the studio, she seemed happy. When she came home, she was quiet. David started questioning the time Tammi spent with Marvin. Why do you look at him like that? Why do you laugh like that? Does making music require being that close? Tammi tried to explain. It's just work, David. Marvin's a married man. We're just singing. But David didn't hear her, because in David's world, closeness was dangerous. Laughter was betrayal, and Tammi needed to belong to him. That's when David started coming to the studio. The first time he showed up, he didn't say anything, just sat in the control room, crossed his arms, and watched. The engineers felt uncomfortable but stayed silent. Marvin continued working. Tammi froze. During the recording, Marvin heard the change in Tammy's voice. Tension, fear. She sang every note as if waiting for David's approval. Marvin considered intervening. He could suggest taking a break. But he looked into Tammy's eyes and understood. A break meant being alone with David, and Tammi didn't want that. So they kept recording, and David kept watching. David's pattern became predictable. He would arrive without announcement, usually in the middle of a session. The studio door would open, and everyone would tense. He never greeted anyone, just walked to the control room, found a chair in the corner, and watched, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for the entire session. The engineers learned to work around him. They wouldn't make eye contact, wouldn't acknowledge his presence. It was easier that way, safer. Marvin noticed that David positioned himself strategically, always where Tammi could see him, always in her peripheral vision, a constant reminder that he was there, listening to every word, watching every gesture, measuring every interaction. One day they were recording Your Precious Love. The song was intimate, romantic, almost private. Marvin and Tammi had to look at each other while singing. Without that emotional connection, the song wouldn't work. On the first take, Tammi couldn't do it. Instead of looking at Marvin, she watched the glass. Watch David. The engineer stopped the recording. Tammi, look at us. Look at Marvin. We need authenticity. Tammi nodded, took a breath, met Marvin's eyes, and started singing. You're my pride and joy. Marvin's voice joined hers. And I'll always be your baby. 2 seconds, maybe 5. There was a real connection, musical, emotional, human. Tammi smiled slightly. Then a sound came from behind the glass. David had stood up. He struck the glass with his fist. Once. Hard. The sound echoed through the entire studio. Tammy's smile vanished. The recording stopped. Silence filled the room. David stared at them for 3 more seconds, then turned and walked out. The engineer looked at the mixing board, pretending nothing had happened. Marvin looked at Tammi. She was shaking, her hands gripping the microphone stand to stay steady. "Do you want to stop?" Marvin asked quietly. "No," Tammi whispered. "Let's finish." Because stopping meant going home, and going home meant facing David. At least in the studio there were witnesses. At least here, there was glass between them. But the glass didn't protect her. It only made David's control more visible, more calculated. He wasn't just watching them record music. He was watching to see if Tammi stepped out of line, if she laughed too genuinely, if she looked at Marvin a moment too long. Every natural human interaction became evidence in David's mind of betrayal. That night, Tammi went home. Marvin stayed in the studio, unable to sleep, staring at the glass David had struck. The next day, Tammi arrived wearing sunglasses. Even in the dim studio lighting, Marvin could see the bruise around her eye. "I fell," she said before anyone could ask. Marvin knew it was a lie. But what could he prove? What could he do? The engineers had seen. They said nothing. Barry Gordy knew. He didn't care. Because David equaled the Temptations, which equaled money. Because scandal equaled brand damage. Because Tammy's safety mattered less than Motown's image. So Marvin did the only thing he could. He made the recording sessions longer. "Let's do one more take," he'd say, even when the previous one was perfect. The engineer would look confused. Marvin wasn't usually a perfectionist in that way, but Marvin understood. Every minute Tammi spent in the studio was a minute she was safe from David. He started requesting additional musicians for sessions that didn't need them, creating reasons for more people to be present. More witnesses meant David was less likely to escalate. The bass player, James Jamerson, noticed what Marvin was doing. One day after a session, he pulled Marvin aside. "I see what you're trying to do, man," Jamerson said quietly. Marvin didn't pretend not to understand. "Is it that obvious?" "To those of us who pay attention, yeah." "Can you keep coming, even when you're not scheduled?" Jamerson nodded. No more words needed to be exchanged. From that day forward, certain Motown session musicians started appearing at Marvin and Tammy's recordings without being called. They'd set up their instruments, run through the tracks, create a buffer of humanity around Tammi. But it wasn't enough. During a break when David had stepped outside to smoke, Marvin approached Tammi. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Why wouldn't I be?" Tammy's voice was flat. "You know why I'm asking. Don't get involved, Marvin. Please. It'll only make things worse. I could help you. Nobody can help me." She said it with such finality that Marvin felt something break inside him. Every day they sang "Ain't No Mountain High Enough," lyrics about overcoming any obstacle for love. But in reality, he couldn't protect her, because intervention meant Tammi would suffer more, because Motown wouldn't allow it, because Marvin's own marriage was collapsing, because everyone was powerless. Marvin tried other approaches. He suggested recording at different studios, hoping distance might help. Motown refused. He proposed recording Tammy's vocals separately from his own, eliminating the need for them to be in the booth together. The producers rejected it, saying the chemistry required them side by side. Every path Marvin explored led to the same dead end. One night, after an especially tense session where David had sat behind the glass for 4 straight hours without moving, Marvin stayed late. He stood in the empty studio, staring at that glass window, and realized something that would haunt him forever. The studio designed to create music had become a cage, and he was as trapped as Tammi was. What Marvin didn't understand yet was that the guilt he felt for not being able to protect her would never leave him. Not after she collapsed. Not after she died. Not ever. October 14th, 1967. Hampton-Sydney College, Virginia. Marvin and Tammi were on stage performing "Ain't No Mountain High Enough" when Tammi suddenly stopped singing. Her eyes went blank. Then she collapsed. Marvin caught her before she hit the stage floor. Ambulance, hospital, brain tumor diagnosis. But as Marvin sat in the hospital waiting room, one question consumed him. Did David's beatings trigger this? The doctors asked. When did the symptoms start? Marvin remembered. Studio days, Tammy's headaches. He remembered David's violence. Repeated blows, bruises, explanations, lies. He couldn't prove anything. But he knew. A week later, David came to visit Tammi in the hospital. Marvin was in the corridor waiting. The two men's eyes met. Neither spoke. But Marvin saw something in David's eyes he hadn't expected. Fear. Because David was wondering the same thing. Did I do this? They stood there 5 feet apart, both carrying the same terrible question. Then David walked past him into Tammy's room. Marvin stayed in the hallway, unable to move. Over the next 3 years, Tammi underwent 8 brain surgeries, 8 attempts to buy more time, to slow the tumor's growth. Marvin visited her when he could, sat by her hospital bed, held her hand, sometimes sang quietly when she was too weak to talk. During one visit, Tammi said something Marvin would carry for the rest of his life. You were never able to help me, Marvin, even when I was standing right next to you. He wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, but Tammi stopped him. It's not your fault. It was never your fault. But you'll think it was. I know you will. She was right. Tammi Terrell died on March 16, 1970, at the age of 24. Marvin was in Detroit when he got the call. He didn't cry immediately. He just sat in silence, holding the phone long after the person on the other end had hung up. After the funeral, Marvin made a decision that shocked everyone at Motown. He announced he would no longer perform live. He would still record in the studio, but he couldn't stand on stage anymore. The thought of performing without Tammi, standing in front of an audience pretending to be happy when he felt destroyed inside, was unbearable. But even recording became torture. Every time Marvin walked into Studio A, he saw that glass. Every time he looked at it, he saw David standing there, arms crossed, watching. Even though David was no longer there, even though Tammi was gone, the glass had become a monument to his failure. In 1974, Marvin performed Your Precious Love live for the first time since Tammy's death. He sang it alone, performing both parts himself. Midway through the song, his voice cracked. The audience applauded, sympathetic. But Marvin heard it differently. He heard pity, and he hated it, because the applause couldn't change what had happened. It couldn't bring Tammi back. It couldn't erase the image of David behind the glass, or the bruises around Tammy's eyes, or the 3 years of suffering that followed her collapse. Studio A's glass walls are still there, but nobody knows what happened behind them anymore. How one man watched, how one woman trembled, how another man stood helpless, and how 3 people, separated by the same glass, lived in 3 different prisons. The recordings Marvin and Tammi made together became classics, songs about love conquering all obstacles. But the truth was darker, quieter, more human. Love didn't conquer anything. The mountain was too high, and some people never make it to the other side. Marvin Gaye carried that knowledge until April 1st, 1984, when his father shot him one day before his 45th birthday. In the years between Tammy's death and his own, Marvin created some of his greatest work. What's Going On? Let's Get It On. Sexual Healing. But every song was haunted by the same ghost. The woman he couldn't save. The glass he couldn't break through. The guilt that never stopped watching.